Hi, my name is Kevin Mack, and this video is about box sizing. By the end of this video, you should understand what box sizing is and how it applies to website development on the front end side. So what box sizing allows you to control is how the widths, padding, borders, and how that content is displayed. Again, at the end of this, we'll kind of go through some examples of it, and you should be able to know what it means when you see it on your next project. So one of the good ways to always get started looking and at code and anything is to go to different sources out there, and this is just looking at the Mozilla org for box sizing. So this gives you a little overview of what it is if you want a deeper dive, but there's really two different values that you can have for the CSS property, which is box sizing, and it's content box and border box. The main thing of what box sizing resolves is consistency on how padding is rendered across different browsers. So that's where it really got popular, and it's kind of a preference for development teams to pick one over the other. It does have a benefit. I use both of them on projects, so content box as well as border box, but again, it's really up to you. But if you're doing one on your project, you need to make sure you understand what it is, so you're not messing up how you're rendering things on a site. So what we're going to do is we're going to jump into CodePen and go through an example and kind of explain what it is. So I'm going to go here, create a new pen. We're not going to need JavaScript here. We'll just need CSS and the rendering here. So I'm going to create something. I'm just going to give it an ID of demo1. So this div is going to have this. We're just going to call this demo1. Underneath here, we're going to create demo2. So demo2. So here we have two different divs. I'm going to use the type selector. You should avoid using type selectors, which is an element, but for purposes of this demo, we're just going to do this. So now you can see that this has two borders inside of it. Another thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say div plus div. Oops. And I'm going to give it a margin top of 20 pixels to kind of separate them out. I cannot type right now. So you can see that these are separated out. Again, div is a type selector. Div plus div is looking at these two next to each other, and that's how I'm spacing it out. This isn't what this lesson's about, but I use this all the time for spacing out stuff. It's a very helpful selector. Just to show you an example of this, if I put a span here in between like hi, you'll notice that the spacing is gone in between them. Now if I use this, a tilde, you will now see that this is spaced right there. Another thing I could also do is the star plus star, meaning that any element next to each other are getting a space in between, which is nice. But anyways, we'll go back and just say div plus div, and I'll get rid of this span here. All right, so now we have demo 1 and demo 2. I'm going to do this and say demo 1, and I'm going to give it a width of 700 pixels. Now, one of the other things in this, I'm going to be using Chrome Developer Tools to kind of demo out some of these pieces and parts. Chrome Developer Tools are really, really helpful in the development process. I use them daily, and now sometimes I don't even use a text editor, because there's a way for you to write your actual Sass code or your CSS code inside the browser and save it out and refreshes. It's kind of nice. You can actually do your true development, save it out to your project inside of Chrome. But for purposes of today, I hope that this little demo of this will give you a better understanding of what Chrome Developer Tools is and then help you align. But get the Chrome Developer Tools. There's some key commands, or you can just right click and go to inspect. It's the easiest way of getting it up, and then it'll pop up this window here. You'll see the entire DOM structure here, and then the associated code with it. So if I right click on this and I say inspect, you'll notice that it says 702 here. I define this demo 1 as 700 pixels, but it's rendering right now at 702. The reason why it's rendering at 702 is because it has a border 1 around it, meaning that there's a 1 pixel on the left as well as a 1 pixel on the right. And that is how the browser by default for WebKit browsers renders it. Now, if I were to also look at this and go to computed, you'll see that it has 700, padding 0, border 1. And that's where you're getting the 1 plus 1, which is 2, of course, and plus 700 to get 702. Now, if I were to add, say, something like, I notice that my demo 1 is, flush against this. So if I put a padding here, I said 20 pixels. What happens is I look at this, and this has now become 742. So what it's doing is it's adding the 1 on each side, the 20 on each side, and the 700 inside here. And then that's how I am now rendering a 742. Now, it's kind of a bizarre way of thinking about this, and I know this kind of confuses developers when they're developing, if they're not familiar with box sizing and border box, to say, like, I've defined this as 700, but for some reason it's rendering as 742. And this can be complex and can cause issues if you have like a floating grid, or if you're even doing flex grid and you have a certain width to it, you may be breaking down a line. So it can get really complex, and it can screw up grids very easily if not done properly or the way that you're expecting it. So to resolve this, I'll be doing that in demo 2 and showing you how we can get it to be that width. But before I do that, I'm going to show you one really cool thing about Chrome Developer Tools. So anytime I highlight an element in my code, you'll see that it adds in all these CSS properties that are associated with it. If I do show all, it expands it to all the ones that I'm not even touching right now. So a deeper dive. Every HTML element has their own associated code to it, and CSS properties that are defined by the browser and the specs themselves. So if I were to do a more complex one, like an input, and right click on this and go inspect, you'll see that there's all these properties associated with it and how it's actually rendering this. So it's pretty cool. So if you're ever like, why is something coming across this way? Like, one of the gotchas for inputs by default, the font size is 11 pixels. It doesn't inherit M's or Rems by default. You have to define it to be that, as well as it renders system UI in Chrome as opposed to what I've defined in my CSS. So that's good to know. But why I bring this up is if we highlight this guy, oops, and we look at what this is rendering. If I go to here and I go down here to box sizing, it's defined as content box right now. So content box is actually the default for box sizing. It's right here. It should say that somewhere on this page, content box, but it is the default of the spec itself and how it's coming through here. So let's go to demo 2. For demo 2, we're also give it a width of 700 pixels, and we'll give it a padding of 20 pixels. So these will be exactly the same. Now let's actually do this so you can see they're one for one. Now the difference is I'm going to add box sizing border box to this guy. So now the only difference between these two, the CSS properties and values are the same, but the only difference is that it is rendering as box sizing border box for demo 2. So now if I look at this, this has now been defined as border box, so that's been overriding that. And one of the things that you'll notice is that we still have the 1 plus 20 plus 20 plus 1, but you'll notice that the content inside of it is now 658 as opposed to 700. So if I were to go here and look at demo 1, it is 700. So what box sizing allows you to do with border box is it allows you to look at how the padding and the additional pieces are rendering. So by having border box, it's keeping everything internally, and the content, the box that's actually around the content, is subtracting out those insides. Where content box is keeping the width, you're defining the width of the content itself, and then adding those pieces on the outside. So that's kind of the hard thing to wrap your head around, but when you think about the width in CSS, is defining the width of the content, not the container itself. But border box allows you to look at the width of the outermost container and how to define it. So one of the ways that a lot of teams do this from the beginning is, well, before I do anything else here, so the other thing that we could do if we didn't have and we didn't realize what border box existed, I've seen people do this. Where demo 3, these two are the exact same width. We look at this, we outline here, it's 700, it's 700 here, but I've defined this as 658. So what it's doing is it's just adding those outside in. This would be a hard thing for me to remember on how to do that, and that's why personally I don't like to think in content box unless my UI is really simple. And I want to build it out that way. So most projects you'll see something like this. This is what you refer to as the star selector. So it's that. And what this means is we're applying it to every element on the page. So if I were to just do this really quick, outline, 1 pixel solid line, you'll see that all these are now outlined with green. So now all these have an outline of green inside them. So every element gets this applied to it. So for me to do this, I can do box sizing, border box. And now every single element on my page is going to have that applied to it. And what this does is, again, it applies that to all of it. So now these will be 700, 700, and this is now also 700. So these two are the exact same. This one just has an over-declared content border box right here. So because it has it both here and here, it's overkill. So I don't really need that ID selector here because they're the same. And now you'll notice that this one is actually going to be 658 as opposed to the 700. So this is 658. This is a very common pattern in CSS, and you'll also see this, which is the pseudo before and after. I typically have this on all my projects. And then if I ever did need to add or treat my padding to be around content box, I then target that specifically. So I like to do this as the default border box. It is consistent from one browser to another. And then if I need to have something where I am looking at the width of the content as opposed to the padding inside of it, I will blow it out there. The other thing to bring up with this is that certain browsers render border box as the default, or render the outside width as the default as opposed to the content. And that's why for myself I use this pattern of box sizing border box with the star selector, and then that way it's applied to everything, so it's consistent from one browser to another. So I mean, that's kind of a quick overview of it. It is really, really important. It is where you see a lot of things get messed up on grids, big misunderstanding on projects. If you have a legacy project that isn't using the star selector box sizing border box, and you apply it at a later time, that can cause major issues with your interface. So it's one of those things from the beginning of your project, you do that. And then if you're building out some new sections inside of it, then just apply it to maybe like some kind of namespace that you have. So you can be tracking those specifically and making sure that you're not breaking anything. But that's basically it. If you have any questions, please leave comments. I'm Nicetransition on Twitter. I'm Nicetransition on CodePen. I'll be adding a link to this CodePen. It's not really much inside here, but if you have any questions about some of the selectors I did or anything about Chrome developer tools, let me know. And if there's anything that you would like to see a video of, let me know in the comments or on Twitter. All right, thanks a lot.